For almost the entire history of our species, there were no cities, roads, farms, or permanent houses. There were no markets where people could get food, no hospitals to treat an infection, and no maps to show the way home. There were only vast landscapes, unpredictable changes in climate, and small human groups trying to make it through one more day. Even so, those people were not incomplete versions of us. They felt fear, curiosity, affection, grief, and hope. They watched the sky, protected their children, recognized voices, planned hunts, and held on to memories. The great question is not only how they survived, it is how a physically vulnerable species managed to grow, occupy such different environments, and turn knowledge into an inheritance that would pass through thousands of generations. To understand that, we need to leave behind the image of the caveman as a brutal, silent creature. The true story of Homo sapiens is far more human, more difficult, and more surprising. The oldest fossils attributed to our species indicate that Homo sapiens already existed in Africa at least 300,000 years ago. But this birth did not happen all at once, as if the first modern human had suddenly appeared. Evolution works through changes that accumulate over many generations. Populations spread across different parts of Africa probably met, separated, and later exchanged genes, techniques, and behaviors again. Some fossils already had faces similar to ours, while other parts of the skull still preserved older features. This shows that the modern body was also assembled gradually. There was no straight line leading inevitably to us. There were branches, extinctions, encounters, and many attempts. Chance played its part. Before we continue this journey, subscribe to the channel and join us for future videos about the origins and mysteries of humanity. Here, every discovery helps rebuild a piece of a story that began long before writing. And the further back we travel, the more clearly we see that what made us human was not a single invention, but the sum of countless shared solutions. The first challenge was staying alive. A small group had to find water, food, and shelter without exhausting everything around it. That is why life was mobile. People followed the rain, the ripening of fruit, the movement of animals, and the level of rivers. In some places, they periodically returned to the same camps. In others, they changed territory when a season became dry, cold, or dangerous. This mobility was not aimless wandering. It demanded a detailed memory of the landscape. People had to know where to find a spring after months away, when certain plants produced fruit, which trails led to mountain passes, and where predators were likely to attack. The territory functioned like an enormous living archive, read through tracks, smells, clouds, winds, and sounds. Losing that knowledge could mean losing the entire group. The day probably began before the most intense heat. While some adults prepared tools or studied signs left by animals, others cared for children, gathered firewood, brought back water, and examined nearby plants. There was no universal routine. The distribution of tasks varied according to environment, age, experience, and immediate needs. The old caricature in which all men hunted while all women simply waited at camp is far too simple. Evidence from different hunter-gatherer societies shows that activities can be flexible. Women also hunted in certain contexts. Men provided care, older people taught, and children learned by taking part. Survival was a collective effort. One person might be an excellent tracker, another knew edible roots, Someone else could recognize changes in the weather. The group's strength came from combining those skills. Getting food required much more than courage. Hunting a large animal was dangerous, uncertain, and costly in energy. Many pursuits ended without success. For that reason, food could include seeds, leaves, tubers, fruit, honey, eggs, shellfish, fish, small animals, and meat acquired through hunting or scavenging. The diet changed from region to region and season to season. Knowing how to dig up a root without destroying it, crack a bone to reach the marrow, or recognize a safe shellfish species was accumulated technology. The menu of early humans was not one single perfect diet. It was a flexible response to what each environment provided. This ability to eat many kinds of food helped Homo sapiens live in savannas, forests, coastal regions, cold landscapes, and places that alternated between abundance and scarcity. Stone tools were essential, but they were not random broken rocks. Producing a sharp blade required choosing the right material, understanding how the stone fractured, and controlling the force and angle of each strike. One mistake could ruin hours spent searching for a good piece of stone. Points could be attached to wooden shafts with fibers, resins, and adhesives prepared with heat. Scrapers worked hides. Blades cut meat and plants. Awls helped produce objects. Wood, bone, and other materials were also used, although they rarely survive as long in the ground. Every tool carried a sequence of decisions. More importantly, it carried a tradition. Someone had to demonstrate the movement, watch the learner, and correct the technique. A skill preserved for generations is a form of collective memory. Fire was known to humans long before Homo sapiens emerged, but it remained one of the foundations of life. It provided light, warmth, and a measure of protection. It made some food softer and safer, extended activity after sunset, and helped people work with materials. Yet keeping a fire was not as simple as pressing a button. People had to obtain dry fuel, protect the flame from wind and rain, carry embers, or know how to make fire again. A fire abandoned carelessly could also cause disaster. Around the flames, the group found a place of closeness. People could share food, tend injuries, prepare for the next day, and recount events. We cannot hear those conversations, but it is difficult to explain human coordination without some complex form of language. Language may have been the most powerful tool of all, even though it leaves no fossils. With it, one person could warn others about a danger that was not present, point out water beyond a hill, teach a technique, or remember someone who had died. Other animals communicate, but humans developed an extraordinary ability to combine sounds and meanings in order to discuss the past, plan the future, and create shared rules. We do not know exactly when fully developed language appeared. We also do not know what it sounded like. It most likely evolved gradually, supported by changes in the brain, anatomy, breathing, and, above all, the need for cooperation. Language allowed the experience of one lifetime to survive the death of the person who possessed it. Knowledge began to travel from mind to mind. That transmission changed childhood. Human children develop slowly, depend on adults for many years, and must learn an enormous amount of information. At first glance, this looks like a weakness. A child who takes a long time to become independent requires constant food, protection, and attention. But this long period also creates space for an extremely flexible brain. By playing, watching, and imitating, children practiced movements, social relationships, and ways of interpreting the environment. Parents did not carry the entire burden alone. Relatives and other group members could help provide care, creating a protective network. Older people, when they survived, were more than mouths to feed. They preserved roots, stories, techniques, and memories of earlier droughts or dangers. In a world without books, an experienced person was a living library. Life, however, could end early. An infected cut, a fracture, a bite, bleeding, or a fever that is treatable today could become fatal. Childbirth carried enormous risks. Children were vulnerable to disease, accidents, and lack of food. This does not mean that everyone died at 30. Low averages for life expectancy are strongly influenced by infant mortality. A person who made it through the early years could live for decades. Ancient skeletons reveal individuals who survived serious injuries and physical limitations. In some cases, this suggests that they received food, protection, or assistance while recovering. Care was not invented by civilization. It appears deeply connected to our evolutionary history. A group that supported its members preserved knowledge, bonds, and trust. At some point, objects began to communicate more than an immediate practical function. Pigments such as ochre were collected, prepared, and carried. Shells were perforated and worn as beads. Marks were carved into bones, stones, or surfaces. Much later, remarkable images would appear in caves and shelters. We cannot reliably translate the meaning of those signs. They might have expressed identity, status, memory, belief, beauty, or belonging. What matters is that an object could represent an idea recognized by other people. This expanded the social world. A necklace was not only material, it could say who someone was. A mark was not only a scratch, it could recall a story. Symbolic thought did not emerge in a single explosion. Its traces appear gradually and unevenly, like parts of an ability that became increasingly visible. And where did these people sleep? Some used caves, but most early humans did not live in them permanently. Caves matter to archaeology because they preserve evidence, not because they were the only available homes. Open-air camps and shelters made from branches, hides, and vegetation were probably common. In cold regions, clothing and carefully worked hides became essential. In hot areas, shade, ventilation, and access to water could matter more. A shelter had to balance safety and practicality because the group might leave only a few days later. Within a camp, space could be organized around fires and activities. Stone fragments, burned bones, and work areas allow archaeologists to reconstruct small scenes, almost as if the ground had preserved the memory of a vanished night. The climate was never a motionless background. Over thousands of years, wet periods turned deserts into green corridors, while dry phases reduced lakes and separated populations. Cold, heat, rainfall, and the availability of animals changed the routes people could take. Homo sapiens grew in a changing world. That instability favored flexibility, but it also erased entire communities. Many migrations probably ended without leaving any known descendants. Others moved forward gradually, following rivers, coastlines, and fertile areas. Leaving Africa was not one organized march. There were different expansions at different times. Some reached Southwest Asia very early. A later expansion made a decisive contribution to the settlement of much of the planet. Each movement unfolded across generations. No one left home, knowing that their descendants would reach another continent. As Homo sapiens entered Eurasia, they encountered other kinds of humans. Neanderthals lived in parts of Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans, known mainly through genetic evidence and a small number of fossils, occupied regions of Asia. These groups were not mindless monsters. They made tools, adapted to difficult environments, and displayed complex behavior. Encounters with sapiens must have varied. There was competition and perhaps violence, but there was also coexistence and reproduction. People living outside sub-Saharan Africa today generally carry a small percentage of Neanderthal ancestry, and some populations have Denisovan ancestry as well. This means the story was not only one of replacement. In part, it was also a story of mixing. The other humans disappeared as distinct populations, but fragments of their history remain in many bodies today. Why, then, did Homo sapiens remain? There is no single answer, and any explanation that seems too simple should make us suspicious. Perhaps wider social networks made it easier to exchange resources and partners. Perhaps tools, subsistence strategies, and communication adapted quickly. The size and connectivity of populations may have helped keep innovations from disappearing. Climate change and random events also mattered. None of this proves that sapiens was always more intelligent or morally superior. Neanderthals survived for hundreds of thousands of years under severe conditions. The survival of a species is not a fair contest in which the best one wins. It is the result of many circumstances, some manageable and others completely unpredictable. Human growth became especially powerful because it was cumulative. One person invented an improvement, someone else learned it. A third person adapted the idea to a new material. Over time, no mind had to start from zero. That process seems ordinary to us, but it changed everything. A stone point could become thinner. A sewing technique could make more effective clothing. A route could be remembered in greater detail. A method of preserving food could sustain the group through a difficult season. Innovation did not mean creating something spectacular every day. Often, it was a small correction preserved by the community. Cumulative culture is like a staircase built by people who never met. Each generation receives a few finished steps and adds others, without knowing how far the staircase will eventually reach. That ability made it possible to occupy extreme environments. To reach cold regions, people needed to master clothing, fire, shelter, and food planning. To cross stretches of sea and reach islands, groups had to use some kind of watercraft and understand currents, winds, or landmarks. To live in dry areas, it was essential to know seasonal water sources and move at the right time. Long before agriculture existed, humans had already reached much of the habitable world. They did not control nature. They negotiated with it. They observed patterns, took risks, and passed on results. Each new environment also transformed communities, their habits, stories, and technologies. There was no single prehistoric life. There were thousands of ways to live. So, was this what life was like for the first humans? In part, yes. Mobile, dangerous, physically demanding, and deeply dependent on nature. But any definitive answer must acknowledge the enormous diversity of times and places. A coastal group gathering shellfish lived differently from hunters in a cold region. Communities separated by tens of thousands of years did not share exactly the same techniques. The phrase "first humans" contains too many stories. What we can say with confidence is that their lives required constant attention, detailed knowledge, and cooperation. They did not have our machines, but they possessed practical intelligence, complex relationships, and an extraordinary ability to learn. The greatest growth of Homo sapiens may not have happened in the size of the brain or the strength of the body. It happened in the invisible space between people. We grew when a discovery began to belong to the group. We grew when we cared for a child long enough for that child to learn. We grew when an older person explained where to find water during a drought. We grew when strangers exchanged objects, stories, or partners. We grew when symbols made it possible to unite people who were not facing the same danger. Gradually, survival stopped depending only on what each individual knew and began to depend on what the community could remember. That is the inheritance we still carry. Every word we use, every tool we hold, and every story we tell rests on an almost unimaginable sequence of earlier lives. Our ancestors did not know they were building the future. They were simply trying to warm a cold night, feed someone, find a path, and understand the world. Yet from those ordinary decisions came a species capable of crossing oceans, recording thoughts, and investigating its own origin. The lives of the first humans were not an empty prologue before civilization. They were the longest chapter of the human experience and the laboratory where many of the abilities that still define us first emerged. When the next night arrives and a light turns on with ease, it is worth remembering what that act once meant. For countless generations, light meant protected warmth, shared food, and safety gathered around a flame. The world has changed, but our need for connection remains. Perhaps that is the deepest answer to the growth of Homo sapiens. We did not succeed because we were invulnerable. We moved forward because we learned together, adapted memories, and turned care into strategy. The story of the first humans is, at its heart, the story of how fragility found strength through cooperation, and it continues every time one person passes knowledge to another. Their memory is still alive in all of us.